And I don't think this behavior happens really often between small alligators and these birds. But spoonbills build their nests on these kind of muddy mounds in swampy marshes in Florida. And the alligators provide a service in that the alligators will eat snakes and small rodents and other birds that might come and eat their chicks on their nest mounds. So they help the chicks. Both. And so they help to protect the mound for the bird. And so it gets a service out of having alligators around. And in return, it looks like spoonbills will kick some of their chicks out of the nest to feed the alligators. Oh man.
Dang. So they're like, yeah, let's go live over here so our chicks can survive. And they're like, nope.
Yeah, it's like they, spoonbills are definitely one of these birds that tends to lay a lot of eggs in comparison to how many chicks they can actually raise. And so when they have a lot of hatchlings and they kind of know that they can't feed them all, then they'll kick them out. And the alligators eat them, and then the alligators stay around the nest because there might be a free meal, and then they help to protect the chicks that are allowed to survive by the parents. It's a weird one. I think it's definitely one of the weirder ones. No, yeah, it's not real. It's not one of those types of ways. So that's what we're going to say. So we'll talk first about symbioses. We'll talk about parasitism and the effects of parasites on both, mostly on the host organism. What's the result? We'll talk about some defenses that hosts can have, just like we did like predator-prey kind of defenses and interactions. And then we'll talk about mutualism, what happens when both species benefit, as in the case of the alligator and the spoonbill. The example that we have here is of a parasitic barnacle on a female crab, and so female crabs will carry their egg pouches in their lower portion of their abdominal area, I was trying to say, until the eggs actually hatch to the little first stage of the larvae. Here we have a barnacle that is growing in the same location. So it gets carried along by the crab just as if she's carrying an egg pouch, and so it gets access to food as it's filter feeding. It has shelter and protection from its predators, but it's a burden on the female crab. She has to carry it around. She won't be able to reproduce as long as the barnacle is sitting where her egg sac should be. Probably not. No. I don't think it's a thing that you can be like, hey, Sally, clean this off me, you know. Probably doesn't even know.
So is symbiosis both parasitism and mutualism?
And commensalism. There are three types of these really close relationships.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We'll see how far we can get into it today in terms of these three interactions definitely bleed over into each other, and that sometimes what starts out as parasitism becomes commensalism, becomes mutualism in the end. And so like a good parasite doesn't kill its host immediately, and perhaps even provides a benefit to the host so that it can stay around longer for being parasite. Okay, all right, so a symbiosis, very simply, is a long-term interaction, a close interaction between two or more species. There are some where there's 3 or 4 different things that are kind of interacting with each other in these weird ways. We can talk about sloths and moths and algae today too, hopefully. But it is one where there's not this direct feeding relationship as in predation. Parasitism definitely, again, bleeds over and crosses these boundaries. And it's not competition, like they're not trying to utilize the same resource. And so it's these interactions very often between different species where there's some effect on both of them. Here we have birds that are cleaning parasites off the antelope. They both get a service and a benefit out of this. The parasite load of the antelope is reduced and the birds get a nutrition resource. And there's some trade-off in this process. So symbiosis, a long-term interaction between at least 2 different species that is not entirely based upon competing for a resource, trying to use it at the same time, or using another organism as a resource. As we've already talked about, there are 3 types of symbioses. You can be a parasite, in which case one of the species involved definitely benefits as a plus, and the other species is harmed, which is a negative. So again, we think of parasitism as a plus-minus relationship. The example here is our lake trout, and it has a parasitic lamprey on it. The lake trout is definitely harmed by losing resources to this parasite, but the parasite gets nutrition, obvious benefit out of latching onto the side of this fish. In mutualism, it's a plus-plus relationship. There's a benefit to both species involved, and the cleaner, do what?
I was just thinking about the water buffalo.
Yeah, so water buffalo and the egrets is a cool one. Definitely the cleaner fish and birds of other mammals and reptiles is going to be an obvious mutualistic benefit. Here, as the water buffalo are like walking, they stir up insects, and so the egrets like to eat the insects. But those insects can also be parasites and problematic for the water buffalo. And so even though the egrets aren't like picking these off the water buffalo, they're preventing the insects from being more of a burden and getting close to the water buffalo by eating them beforehand. And so they like hang out together all the time. So I see egrets in cow fields, and it comes from this type of relationship. The third one is commensalism, which we won't talk about very much today, is a +0 relationship in that one species benefits, the other appears to have no impact, is neutral in the relationship. And one of the classic examples of this are the barnacles on this gray whale. And the barnacle benefits, it gets habitat, it gets access to currents as the whale is swimming, but the whale doesn't really matter that it has a whole bunch of barnacles on. It doesn't slow it down. Barnacle, even though it's attached in its blubber layer, doesn't affect its overall nutrition and ability to mate or reproduce. You can have a whole bunch of barnacles, you can have like a whole practical kelp forest growing off the tail of a blue whale. Doesn't seem to bother at all. Clear benefit for the hitchhiker, no impact on the host organism.
So like a guy and his dog would be mutualism,
Hopefully, yeah.
and then a guy and a cat would be parasitism.
Yeah, probably. Or I always think of like, why do you keep parakeets? Oh, yeah. I'm glad that there are cat people in the world. I'm not a cat person.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to start with parasites. When one species clearly benefits the parasite and the other, the host organism, is harmed. In terms of parasites, they're often small, and that again gives them an advantage where they can escape notice of the host in a variety of different ways, and then they can take a lot of resources and get a lot of benefit without doing a lot of immediate harm to the host by being small and needing few resources. And they tend to be super specialized, so they are particularly adapted to be parasites of one or a few species, and that by being specialized, they gain access to this resource that's not available to everyone. That also means though that they're limited and they're very reliant upon their host. There's a whole suite of different benefits that a parasite gets. Usually there's a nutritional food benefit. They're feeding off some portion of the host, but that's not always the case. Most often when they're feeding on the host, they're also getting shelter from the elements or from their predators. Very often the host, while it's providing shelter and food, then it's also dispersing the gametes or the fertilized eggs or the larvae of the parasite to the next host. And so this relationship has developed and is beneficial to the parasite for a lot of reasons. In the case of our malaria parasite, which is this little protozoan here, it utilizes a couple different hosts, a mammalian host for the red blood cell where it replicates itself. It utilizes the mosquito as its dispersal host. It's not actually doing any growing and reproducing inside the mosquito, but it does get shelter and the ability to move from host to host in its mosquito vector. And it's not uncommon for parasites to have more than one host. The other partner in the parasitic relationship is the host organism, the one that carries the parasite and is harmed, that's providing the food and the shelter and the dispersal. It's very often a non-lethal interaction, and that's again to the parasite's advantage. If you kill your host too fast, you won't get much food, shelter, or dispersion from it. But there are definite consequences, the classic ones that we've been talking about throughout the semester: reduced survival, reduced growth, reduced reproductive ability come from carrying a parasite because it takes away resources from your own survival, reproduction, and growth. In some cases, it causes malnutrition. It can actually take away vital nutrients or calories that you need, again, causing you to be stunted, affecting your reproductive ability. And in a few cases, it modifies your behavior, which leads to very interesting hypotheses and some of the myths that we generally have in our culture about mummies and zombies and the dead coming back to life definitely come from parasitoid host relationships in some cases. There are just several different ways that we're going to talk about here to kind of define parasites. There's, again, in talking about predators and parasitism, we get this boundary crossing in our vocabulary. And you can define parasites very, very narrowly as, just these organisms that use food and shelter, dispersion resources from a host. Or you can get really broad with what we're talking about in terms of a parasite. And so things like vampire bats can be considered parasites because they come and they, lick blood from other organisms. We don't tend to, how do we define that in that instance? What is it actually doing? Viruses, when they infect a single host cell, take over the cellular machinery, cause it to die. Are they acting as predators or parasites? Well, different portions of their life cycle, they're doing different things. So, for some people, this term gets thrown around very loosely, and for others, it has a very particular meaning, and they're really into parasite hosting. All right. There's all different, again, kind of categories of parasites based upon what they're actually doing as a parasite. The kleptoparasites, again, are some of the most interesting organisms out there. These are brood parasites and the food stealers. These are organisms that steal resources from other organisms. They take the benefits of their nesting ability, their food gathering ability, and they steal it for themselves. And sometimes this happens then within a species. Sometimes it crosses species boundaries. And the top picture, we have, I think it's a cowbird egg that has been laid in a normal songbird nest. And so the cowbirds and the cuckoos lay their eggs in other bird species' nests. And then the other birds raise their offspring for them. They usually put one egg in every nest until they've laid however many eggs they're going to lay that particular season. The cuckoo and the cowbird offspring are generally bigger at birth, and they grow more quickly than the other birds that they're parasitizing. And as a result, the adult birds of the other species spend more time feeding the cuckoo and the cowbird offspring because it's bigger and more demanding and more aggressive. Sometimes these birds will actively, again, push other nestlings out of the nest so that they gain greater access to resources. That's stealing resources from another organism. You're not directly feeding on them, but you are getting shelter and food resources from the adult birds. In sexual parasites, like our anglerfish that we saw a few weeks ago, we have a male or female organism that becomes a parasite on the other gender. And the benefit is that you get reproductive success, but the consequence is the other partner has to carry you around and feed you and take care of you. And again, the anglerfish males that parasitize and become stuck on the anglerfish females are a classic.
Would that not be like a mutualism then?
It is bleeding over into mutualism, and again, it just depends upon how you want to define this relationship. Like from the female's perspective, this is definitely mutualism because she's getting fertilized eggs out of it. There's a benefit to her. But there's also this like burden of carrying the male around. And so there's not just full benefit like we think of in true mutualism. In terms of the male, it seems full benefit, like he doesn't have to do anything else. I mean, you could also look at it from his perspective. Yeah. I think that's still an open question. He loses independence, is what I was going to say, that he becomes joined to this female and he loses his ability to find other females to mate with. Like, what if she's a bad mate for one reason or another? What if she dies? He's also dead. Yeah. And so it's a fraught relationship for both.
You said fraught?
Yeah.
What like the word means?
It's like There's complexity.
Oh, okay.
Telling one of my kids he's good at reading is a fraught statement because the other one will overhear and be offended.
Okay.
Like, it's good, but it's also bad. There are obvious downsides. Parasitoids we introduced before in talking about predation. In parasitoids, the next generation is what feeds and kills the host. And that's what we see in the case of our spider here that's being parasitized by a wasp larvae. It happens in some fungi too. We'll see if I have some examples of the fungi here. The fungi tend to be, they do it to a lesser extent with anything other than certain types of insects, so ants and spiders can, that they tend to grow on. And they change the behavior of them. So then they crawl out on the ends of leaves where the fruiting bodies of the fungi can have good spores for them. So it's pretty cool. Parasites can be big or small. And again, they tend to be small and specialized. They don't have to be in the case of the lamprey. I mean, that's a big organism in comparison to its host. Generally, they're big, call them macroparasites. They tend to have big body sizes, and they have long generation times. And macroparasites usually move between more than one host over the course of their life. They can feed on one host for a period of time. When that host begins to do poorly and does not provide as good of a resource, they'll move hosts. Fleas, tick, fungi, nematode worms, the isopod crustacean on the top of this fish is a classic macroparasite organism. These bloodsuckers, again, that move from one host to another over the course of their individual lifetime tend to be these macroparasites. You can see them with the naked eye. You might even consider something like a mosquito a macroparasite in that it's going to several different hosts and taking a blood nutritional food resource. The contrast to that are our small microparasites, our bacteria, viruses, protists, like the malaria parasite. They tend to live inside one host and do their kind of larval stage to adult reproductive stage inside that one host. And it takes them a very short period of time to go from infecting larvae or adults to sexual maturation and release of either gametes or fertilized offspring to disperse to the next host. Once the adult organism is in a host, it's stuck there for its life cycle. And it'll either die as the host dies, or its life cycle will finish once it is done reproducing. We call it an infection when you have a very heavy load of parasites, to the point where, again, in human biology, you have an infection when it starts to show symptoms of the load of parasite that you have. The amount of bacteria or virus has killed enough cells that you don't function as you normally would. You run a fever, you have sweats, you are sneezy and coughy, you feel run down and have fatigue. You are malnourished. Very intense parasite loads and infections can lead to disease, actual states of human physiology where we consider that you are in an abnormal homeostatic. That was cool. Big parasites, little parasites, parasites. Okay. Plants can be parasites too. We won't talk too much about plant parasites, but there are two types of categories of plant parasites. You can be a hemiparasite, in which you yourself are still capable of photosynthesis, but you do rely upon your host organism for water and nutrients. So in a hemiparasite, you're only like partially a parasite. You can still photosynthesize and create your own carbon energy resource and fixed carbon for building blocks, but you're relying upon your host plant usually for water and nutrients. And so in this picture, we have something like mistletoe. I was like, that thing we're all going to put up in our houses in a few weeks. Mistletoe is a parasitic plant, still has green leaves, but it is embedded into the tissue of its host plant, which provides it with water and nutrients. In particular, it's It's focused on the vascular tissue, the xylem, that actually flows those materials to the plant rather than the flow of the plant. And the xylem in these guys is generally on the outside again, and so you can see it's grown inward to the host plant, but it's not all the way into kind of the core of this tree. You get a high enough heavy parasite load, though, you can overburden the host tree. You can actually be so heavy that you'll break the branch off. That would be bad for you and the tree. You can be taking so many resources that you kill your host tree. Lots of the parasitic vines that we have in our region, like winterberry, again, they put roots into the living tissue of the host tree in order to get access to water and nutrients, but they themselves photosynthesize and will have green leaves during the appropriate season. The contrast to that is a holoparasite. This is a plant that's entirely dependent upon the host plant, does not photosynthesize, it does not have chlorophyll. In many cases, they often look like a fungus because they lack those photosynthetic pigments in their leaves and stems, as in the case of this thing that we have in our picture here. Everything they get comes from their host, and I think this is brood rape, the actual thing that's mentioned here is what's in our picture. I'm not a botanist, right? And I have not claimed to be all semester, but my knowledge of parasitic plants is not something that I've ever gone deep into the interest of, although they're incredibly interesting. I think like with carnivorous plants, the selective forces that allow these specializations to arise are really interesting ecologically. Like, obviously these plants have lost chlorophyll, okay? And so what in their environment would have seen that as a good thing to do was really interesting. Where can you be so sure that you're going to find a host plant that you stop photosynthesizing yourself?
Appeal to like normal grace type feathers and all that.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you quit looking like a plant, maybe you lose predation. So that's enough an advantage that you should do that.
Look like a plant.
Dead. That's fine. So holoparasites, kind of the opposite of our normal primary producers. All right. Another way that we categorize parasites is by how they move from host to host, or how they move from the environment into a host organism. And so again, you can have direct or indirect transmission of parasites. In direct transmission, they move from one host to another without an intermediary host in between, without what we're going to call a vector. So fleas and ticks, viruses, bacteria, lice, sexually transmitted diseases, the bot flies, which is what is infesting this poor little squirrel host. Those are direct transmission parasites where either the adults or the larvae spread from one host to the next host. They're moving with the air, the wind, the water, the soil, or their own mechanisms of movement in order to get from host to host. They're not spending time inside another organism to get on to their next host. And again, we can think of, the next slide, of course, will be about indirect transmission. In this case, everything is a primary host for these organisms. That's the organism in which they're going to do their parasitism, is in this one particular type of organism. The bot flies are particularly gruesome parasites in that the adult flies, female flies lay their eggs inside the tissue of usually a mammal, and then the larvae comes out of the egg and grows for a period of time and develops into the adult inside your tissue subcutaneously. And then it emerges as the adult organism. It's gross. And you get these boils as a result of it, where you have this infected tissue that's trying to deal with this invader around it. Yeah.
I know I have horses, and I know that they do that, but it's not the same as that. They can't itch it off, and the bot flies develop it inside the inner stomach, and it's released in the feces.
Yes. So some of these guys do crazy things, in that they'll utilize different tissues of the host for different portions of their life cycle, exactly like that. And so I think I have an example of a meningeal, either worm or bacteria in a couple slides, where it's like First it infects, and then it goes through the digestive system for one part and gets pooped out, and then as the grazer eats its contaminated grasses with its own feces, then it re-ingests the next life stage, which infects its brain and kills it.
Ooh.
Don't eat where you food. Yeah. There's another great Radiolab story about a man who gets infected by a botfly in the tropics, and then he decides to let it hatch when he goes back to New York City. I'm like, that's just gross. All right, so of course there are indirect transmission, and this involves an intermediate host vector that is responsible for moving you from one primary host to another. And so vectors are organisms that transmit parasites from one host to another. So ticks are themselves parasites, macroparasites that have direct, transmission from one host to another. But ticks can carry the bacteria, the spirochete shown here, that causes Lyme disease. And as such, ticks are a vector of indirect transmission for the Lyme disease causing bacteria. Mosquitoes are the indirect transmission vector for the malaria protozoan. Beetles can transmit Dutch elm disease from one tree to another. And again, Dutch elm disease is caused by a fungus that has just decimated American forests since it was brought over, again, as an invasive species from the Eastern Hemisphere. Definitely in terms of Dutch elm disease, my mom talks about living in the Chicago suburbs in the 1960s, and every street was tree lined. And then Dutch elm disease came in, and all of the trees died. It was just a huge and complete, ecosystem turnover when this invasive organism came in. And it's difficult to control because it has an indirect transmission vector. Taking down trees is not a preventative measure because the beetles will just carry it from one tree to another, and the beetles can be feeding on several different species of trees in the process. And elm trees are the only ones susceptible to the fungus. As climate changes, lots of these tick-borne diseases are becoming more prevalent here in the United States as the range in which ticks can inhabit expands. So usually ticks are knocked back by hard, cold winters, and as we have less intense winters in terms of length, they can be individually very intense in terms of temperature and cold, then the ticks can spread across a wider range. Also, as we have more people that are going out into the natural wilderness, we're having more interactions between people and ticks, and we're getting a much faster spread of some of these tick-borne diseases. Lyme disease is one that's treatable, especially if you catch it early. But if you have it, it is a long-term kind of chronic illness that you have to deal with if you're not able to fully clear it early on. Okay, all right. And again, with this type of indirect transmission, we can talk about definitive hosts versus intermediate hosts. Definitive host, the parasite becomes an adult and reaches sexual maturity in that one. When we get intestinal worms, these types of trematode worms, tapeworms, we're the definitive host for that organism. The larvae comes in, we ingest the eggs in something that we have eaten, and the adult attaches to the lining of our stomach and becomes sexually reproducing organism in our gut, where the nematode worms definitive host. An intermediate host is one that hosts an intermediate life stage. It might not be the sexually reproducing stage. It might just be a larval life stage or carrying gametes from one place to another. And so again, is it a vector or is it an intermediate host? The boundary can be very vague in terms of, is it actually growing and taking something from the intermediate host, or is it just being carried by it? And again, as hosts and parasites interact with each other, there's coevolution, and these things interact in very interesting ways. This is a Meningeal worm I mentioned a minute ago. In this case, there's all this weird stuff that's happening inside the deer. And it is transmitted again and carried for a portion of its life cycle inside the snail. And so what happens is that the eggs here are kind of spawned by the sexually reproducing adults. in the organism, and they travel up to the brain, where they then will eventually kill and interact with this deer. But the way that it gets infected in the first place is that it ingests this infective kind of larval stage, which then gets pooped out into this other stage, which gets taken up by the snail. And when the deer eats its poop-infested, snail-infested environment, it gets reinfected. So the stage that's going to become the adult. It's like definitive host the deer, intermediate, perhaps vector, host is the snail. Which is glad for your deer. Aren't a deer. I can get this type of Meningeal Worm infection.
Quick snails.
Cooked snails, that's another good take on this. All right, so hosts are not just out there getting infected with parasites all the time, right? Like they have defenses, just like they have defenses against other types of predators. And so one of the first and foremost defenses for most organisms against getting a parasite, particularly these macroparasites that attach to the outside of you for one reason or another, is to have a behavior that removes the parasites. And so grooming behaviors that we see across all different types of organisms, from reptiles and amphibians into mammals and birds, a lot of what they're doing is removing parasites from the outside of the body. And they either eat them, and they can provide a nutritional resource, or they crush them and throw them away, or in the process of removal, they get killed. It helps, again, in removing parasites, and this is key, again, for organisms that live in herds, packs, or family units, that if one organism has a parasite, it's likely going to spread to everybody else as that parasite reproduces. And so it's to their advantage as a community, as a population, to control parasite load with grooming behavior. There are other effects of grooming in relation to social behavior and hierarchical herd structure, but first and foremost, parasites. Lots of times, too, we see that organisms will avoid habitats where parasites are found or where they're easily transmitted. And so again, we know that there are a lot of mosquitoes and ticks in certain areas. We avoid those areas as humans, as we avoid those parasites. Other big mammals will do the same thing. They'll stay away from those areas. They'll only go into them for short periods of time to get the particular resource they need. They won't spend their time there if they can't. Okay. That's kind of the outer response of host to parasites. Inside your body, you also have an immune system response to either a bite from a parasite or an internal infection from either a macro or a micro parasite. We think of endoparasites as parasites that are inside your body, in your tissues, ectoparasites as things that are on the outside of your body. So grooming cannot really help you with endoparasites. There you have to be reliant upon your immune system in order to contain the infection, to kill off the parasite, or in order to combat its spread to other organisms. So the first thing your body does when you get a parasite is that you have an inflammatory response. The tissue swells up. You send blood and white blood cells there. It gets hot to the touch as the temperature rises in an attempt to kill off whatever is in your tissue. Oftentimes you'll get a cyst, an encircling of dead tissue, scar tissue around the living parasite as your body tries to wall off resources from this invader. This can happen in animals as well as in plants. The same types of things happen in plant immune systems. And the top picture, we have a little encysting worm or larvae that has been found in human tissue. And again, like you can just pop it out once it forms these types of cysts, and that it becomes walled off from your actual system. And removal of it doesn't actually harm you or cause any bleeding, but you have this thin hole in your body where you pull this thing out. On the kind of long-term immune response is then when you're actually going to have antibodies that form to a particular parasite invader and then mark it for consumption by your body and kind of your immune system to come in and engulf and encircle those things. Your immune response is particularly effective against things like invading bacteria and viruses and protists. That's what it is developed for, that is what it is called for. Your immune system, in terms of antibodies, has a little bit of a harder time dealing with the big macroparasites. That's where your inflammatory response really comes in. We saw in our squirrel had that big inflammation around that botfly infection, classic inflammatory response. All right, plants do the same things. As I mentioned, they will insist and try to wall off invading parasites. When we get these cysts and tumors that tend to form around these parasites on roots, we call them cysts or scabs, and on leaves and stems, we call them galls. And so the oak tree in my backyard classically has an infection where it makes all these little galls on its leaves. Just year after year after year, I'm constantly like, when is this poor tree going to pick it? Because it turns out, beautiful green every spring, and then by midsummer, it's got wilty leaves and they're all covered in these galls, as it is obviously fighting some type of infection. I'm not as interested enough in it to actually call out an arborist to treat the tree, but it's a little bit interesting. In our region, we tend to see these kind of goldenrod galls. Again, this is often an insect larvae that has been implanted in the tissue, and the plant is trying to encase it and keep it away from doing any more harm to the plant. There's all kinds of different parasites for plants. They'll specialize in certain types of tissue, they'll specialize in certain types of plants, and you kind of classically get this. One of the cool things about these types of stem and leaf galls is that they're often really brightly colored. The idea is to attract a predatory bird to come and eat the gall. And the birds learn that there is nutritious tissue both from the plant and the larvae inside the galls. And so then that helps to remove parasites from the plants by producing these brightly colored structures that look like berries or fruits that then attract birds to eat them. Okay. All right, so what's the effect of a parasite? Again, kind of our classic lowering survival and reproduction, lowering growth, having an effect on finding a mate, which then affects your reproductive capability. The same things that happen from competition, the same thing that happens from predation effects, same thing for parasite effects. So effects of parasites, they lower survival and reproduction because they steal resources from you. And in doing so, they give you fewer resources to avoid predators, and they give you fewer resources to put towards producing offspring. And our example from our textbook here is the Western fence lizard. These cute little organisms. They found that when the lizards are infected with malaria, there is a 20% reduction in their clutch size, the number of eggs they lay. Because the female stores less fat and has less energy available, resources to put into laying eggs. Uninfected females lay 20% more eggs than those. It also affects males, but in a different way. Malaria infection in males, they show fewer courtship behaviors, and they have different coloration, and their testes are smaller as a result of having less resources for sperm production and to put into mating. And as a result, malaria-infected males will have fewer mates and father fewer offspring. And so there's a similar effect on both genders in terms of fecundity and reproduction effects. And definitely, if you're putting fewer resources into making offspring, you have fewer resources for yourself as well, and that will affect your long-term survival. Okay. In terms of lower survival and reproduction, again, that idea with the Western fence lizard that it can affect your ability to attract a mate. This example comes from zebra finches, and here the parasite infection affects the overall immune system and health of the organism. And as a result, they have fewer of the displays necessary to get a mate. And in this case, if the males are really healthy, they're going to be able to produce enough carotenoids from getting enough food to make a really bright orange fluorescent beak color. And that's what females are looking for in these types of birds. It's like the more fluorescent orange your beak, the sexier you are. And so if you're sick, you're not going to get enough food, you're not going to deposit enough carotenoids in your bill, you are not going to look as healthy, and you will get fewer mates. So less brightly colored beaks means less successful mating. The higher your parasite load, the less mates you'll have. So I guess if you're a zebra male finch, you should like be very picky about your food items and what parasites you could actually be ingesting. Probably then again help you in terms of getting a brightly colored beak in a lot of the. Okay. The kind of weird thing here too is that this is an example of a parasite altering behavior that leads to increased predation. And so having a parasite load affects your survival, not necessarily because it takes resources, but because it puts you in harm's way more frequently. And this is the case of the killifish, and they can get infected with trematode worms. And having a high trematode worm load actually causes the killifish to surface, to come closer to the surface of the water, and they like jerk and spasm around, like they flop around like a dying fish. And this attracts their predators, these fish-eating birds. And it turns out that the fish-eating bird is the host that the worm wants to be in. The killifish is just an intermediate host for them, and the fish-eating bird is the actual host in which they'll reach sexual maturity as a worm and reproduce it. And so the alteration of behavior affects the killifish by increasing predation risk. It brings them closer to their predators and attracts their predators' attention and is changed in behavior. So it really affects their long-term survival. Here we see, again, kind of an intensity of infection. There's a bit of increasing amount of this surfacing and twitching behavior the higher your parasite load is. And then if we look at the population that are eaten by birds, if you don't have any worms, you hardly get eaten by these fish-eating birds. You have less than 1,400 cysts. Gotta have an intermediate predation rate, but if you have more than 1,400 nematode cysts, you're very likely to be eaten by a fish-eating bird, which is what the worms want. I should feel bad for the host. Yeah, it is. Like the worm here isn't really feeding off your tissue, but it is causing you to be eaten by what would be its definitive host. Okay. That's on an individual scale. The effect of a parasite on an individual organism is lowered survival, reproduction, and growth rate. On a population scale, parasites can be one of these density-dependent regulators of population size. And so this definitely plays a greater factor in what we call naive host, new host-parasite relationships. In a naive host, they have not really seen or been exposed to this parasite before, and as a result, the parasite just rips through the population and can really cause population numbers to decline because so many individuals die, usually in a short period of time. It is spread in a density kind of either independent or dependent fashion. We have here Chestnut Blight, which is an infectious fungus, again, that has just decimated American chestnut trees. At the bottom, we see rinderpest, which is a virus that affects a variety of different types of ungulate herbivores. When this virus got loose in the kind of African savanna region, to a naive population of cattle, like everything just dies within a matter of weeks. You have animals that just keel over. Today, we have many types of both antibiotics as well as vaccines that we apply to organisms, particularly in ranching, in order to avoid these types of parasite host impacts, because high density ranching and poultry farming is really susceptible to these types of parasite infections. Long term, you can have regulation of host population size, again, in a density dependent fashion, that when hosts get really abundant, parasite load increases, causes a certain amount of death and mortality, reduces host population size, and parasites then will follow in a very cyclical fashion, similar to our predator-prey interactions. So in these types of long-term interactions between hosts and parasites, much more of a density-dependent regulator of organisms, acting in our classic Block-Volterra predator-prey interactions. Usually low infection rates, normally in the population, When the host population gets dense, so do the parasites. And you'll have an outbreak of increased mortality that reduces host population sizes. The parasite reduces as the host declines, and then it starts over again. Rabies as a virus in foxes, as well as other types of small mammals, is a classic example of this. When the fox population gets big, they can have rabies outbreaks. You'll have lots of individuals that are infected and high mortality rates. When the fox population reduces, then the transmission of the virus declines. There's always a few foxes that are carrying it and that are asymptomatic, even though they have a viral infection before they actually succumb to the virus. Rabies is one of those interesting viruses that interacts a little bit differently with its different mammalian hosts in terms of the time frame before it becomes problematic. Definitely is a behavioral altering virus too, in that it causes its highly infected host in order to become more aggressive, in order to become more interested in being around other members of the same species, so that it can get transmitted onto the next host before that one dies. Hopefully all of you have your rabies vaccine. It remains lethal. Cool. All right. One thing that's pretty interesting, of course, is when you have not just an even distribution of organisms across an environment, but when you have clumping. And particularly if you have a high parasite load on a particular host, that can be really interesting as well. And that in normal kind of conditions, every host, in terms of something like a tick, might have one or a few ticks on it, but then there's always a few hosts in the population that have a really high parasite load. They're like clumped on that one host for one reason or another. And so that then, of course, causes those individuals with a higher parasite load to have lower survival and reproduction, to make them more susceptible to other diseases that will kill them off. And so then it can have a density-dependent impact on the population, not because the density of hosts has changed, but because the density of parasites causes a particular effect on the host. It's dependent, the density here is dependent on the load of parasites rather than the density of the host population in general. Shrew ticks and lungworm and bighorn sheep are an example of this. Usually, every shrew and every bighorn sheep has one parasite, but on some individuals, there's just a ton. And it's those individuals that are suffering from an infection and have disease-like symptoms from these parasites, rather than everybody else that just kind of carries them along with them and deals with it. Okay. The last thing here to consider then is coevolution of hosts and parasites, in that there's an interaction between these defense mechanisms and the parasite. And then again, there are different selective factors in terms of defense, as well then as host and in terms of host defenses and parasite responses. Parasites can become more lethal. They can overcome host defenses. But long term, that can lead to earlier death of your host, which is bad for you as a parasite. So we see these kind of interesting things. Definitely, a terrible animation. Endless arms race, just like we see in predator-prey relationships. The host evolves a new defense, the parasite evolves a new invasion mechanism. Again, classic virus bacteria changing proteins that are displayed and then what are acting as infective mechanisms. A host can evolve a particular antibody, then the parasite evolves new display characteristics to evade that host immune system. And HIV virus is a classic example of this. HIV evolves within individuals to continually be evolving to evade the host immune systems. And this will change over time, even within an individual. Okay. But lethality is selected against for a parasite. And again, a dead host can't transmit you to the next host, and it kills you if you're an endoparasite, if that is your definitive host. So you don't want to kill your host too soon, and you want a long-term relationship. And that means that you become less of a parasite. You become less lethal. You have fewer effects. You take fewer resources from your host if you're a good parasite, both in short term as well as in these long-term species interactions that we're thinking about. Very virulent diseases and viruses with direct transmission. As a result, they have a hard time jumping from host to host. When you get one of these very virulent parasites, you get really sick and you're prone to dying, right? Yeah, there's a high lethality. But the transmission and the spread of it is relatively short. And Ebola is a classic example of this. Ebola is a new virus in the human population, and it classically lays you out and kills you within the first week of infection. It means that it can't spread very far because within 48 hours, you're incapacitated. You're only going to spread it to your close family members. That's bad for the Ebola virus. It really wants to get out and do stuff. Okay. But if you're a relatively easy parasite to carry, you don't cause a lot of problems for your host. Your host will carry you across the world. Okay. And that's what the cold virus has done, the flu virus. They are extremely well adapted to their host in that they don't cause very severe symptoms. They lie in wait and are infectious for a long time before a host starts to show symptoms. And thus they get transmitted exactly to new hosts as they want to be before they become problematic for an individual host. There's a gradient, of course, between Ebola and cold virus, and that's where HIV is, right? Like, it is doing stuff within an individual host. It's fairly infectious in body fluids, but it is a wimp if it gets just laid out on a surface. It's really actually difficult to directly transmit HIV without very close contact between two individuals or a mistake that happens in a medical procedure in the medical industry.
What do you mean by vertical transmission?
So vertical transmission is when you get passed from a parent to an offspring.
Oh, okay.
So there are a few parasites that if usually your mom has it, she'll give it to you at birth or during pregnancy. Same thing with some viruses.
Okay.
The super cool, interesting thing is that we are beginning to understand that the reason that placental mammals form placentas may be a result of a viral infection and activation of certain genes in our genomes. And that without exposure to that virus, we would never have developed as placental mammals, which of course is a huge benefit to us. It's totally weird. And so again, that like interaction between hosts and parasites can be really interesting on an evolutionary time scale. Cool. Okay, I'll answer that. Oh yeah, so moving on from parasitism then, this interaction between hosts and parasites, the first thing that can do then is evolve into commensalism, where now the parasite is benefiting, but they're not actually harming their host any longer. And maybe that's the goal of every host-parasite interaction evolutionarily, is to stop killing your host eventually, having a burden on them, and to become a commensalism organism, where you benefit and your host carries you indefinitely around with it. And again, there are different gradients in this. If you think we can see different viruses and bacteria in the process of their disease evolution, going from being a parasite, very lethal, to something that is much more benign, low lethality, but higher transmission. And eventually, you'll become a mutualist, where you're not just a burden on your host, you're actually a benefit. And so the host may seek you out in order to gain resistance to another disease or to gain access to a new resource. Definitely, all of our microbiome, these microorganisms that hitch a ride on our bodies, are somewhere between a parasite and a commensalist and a mutualist. Sometimes they do big benefits for us as they're getting nutrients and shelter from our bodies. They help us digest food. They fight off invading bacteria that would otherwise harm us and then harm them in the process. Other times they really appear to be hitchhikers that are along for a joyride. Like, they don't give us any benefit. They don't really harm us by being part of our microbiome. Other times they're problematic. Staph infections happen when you get normal skin bacteria inside you and it starts to act like a parasite. In a mutualistic relationship, both species benefit in kind of weird ways sometimes. So the examples here are that rats that have tapeworms grow bigger. So they will actually live longer, reproduce more, potentially have more mates because they have a tapeworm. Kind of the opposite effect that you'd expect from having a tapeworm. Mollusks that have flukes, which are again another type of parasitic worm, develop thicker shells, which is a benefit against predators for them. Helps them withstand wind and wave action better. And so having a parasite becomes a mutualistic relationship. Wolbachia infections increase reproduction in arthropods. So again, this is a type of bacteria. It actually means that they'll produce and lay more eggs than they would otherwise. So again, you want one of these mutualistic relationships. Definitely started out as a parasite, something that was infectious and causing potentially disease, became helpful. And again, as we move from parasitic to mutualistic relationships, oftentimes it's because of a mutation in a host or a parasite. Something changes fundamentally in their genome that causes them to have a beneficial phenotype when the parasite is present. Those individuals grow and reproduce better. That mutation becomes a staple of that particular type of host population. Okay, turn to your neighbor. See if you can come up with an example of a mutualistic relationship. I've given you a bunch already today. These are, you can think of one that I have not mentioned.
I'll brainstorm here. Oh yeah. Ants and aphids. Clownfish and sea anemones. Ants like protect the aphids, and the aphids somehow like produce food for them.
Yeah, they do.
I don't know the exact mechanism for that.
And I just saw this one recently, or else I probably wouldn't get it quite right. But the aphids eat plant nectar, or sour. They drill into plants and eat the liquid. And as a result, they have a ton of sugar and carbohydrates in their system. And yeah, their poop essentially is this sugar-rich fluid. And so the ants will walk up to the behind of the aphid and like suck nectar right off the aphid. And in return, the ants protect the aphids then from things that would come in and eat them, like all the types of insects and birds. And so they provide protection racket for these like food resources. Definitely a type of nutritional trophic relationship with a bit of defense in there too, for good measure.
I guess bees and flowers are these.
Good, exactly. And again, that level of mutualism is enormous, right? There's all these degrees. Like the ants and the aphids are in a really tight mutualistic relationship, but the bees and the flowers, with their dispersion of pollen and then the food resource the bees get as a result, like that's really diffuse, right? An individual bee is going to visit a whole bunch of different species of flowers, a whole bunch of individuals. And so there's a whole bunch of, it's less direct, the relationship, but it's still mutualistic.
Cool. It's all around us.
It is. And again, we identify so easily competition and predation because it's like so in your face. But the mutualistic relationships are almost more interesting because they indicate a level of intimacy that rises to a benefit for both species rather than a plus minus, as in the case of both of either predation or competition or parasitism. It's like, it's that perfect little happy world view, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so mutualism and a close relationship where it's plus plus for both, either in some way enhances survival, growth, reproduction. It can vary between the partners as to what they're getting out of the relationship. It varies in the benefits, like we just talked about. Our relationships here are nutrition at its base, but then there's defense and dispersal as well as trophic interactions. The degree of dependency, as we just talked about, sometimes it's super tight, sometimes it's very diffuse to relationships. The specificity, sometimes it's like 2 species of algae and fungi that make a lichen, and like that's all it can be. Other times it's just huge, right? Again, with the bees and the flowers. And the duration of the relationship. Again, bee and flower, instantaneous, momentary interaction. In the case of the bobtail squid here, it has special sacs in which it grows a mutualistic bacterium that glows and provides its bioluminescence, Vibrio fischeri. And so that's a long-term, very specific, immediate interaction. The bacterium gets shelter and essentially food resources from the tissue of the octopus. The squid, I should say, gets bioluminescence, which it used both in predator defense as well as in eating.
How does it get the bacteria? Like bird?
Yes, it looks like it's vertical transmission.
Sick.
These guys also the bacterium also live in the environment in general, and so you can get repollinized pretty easily, I think. But it is one of those kind of vertical transmission. Again, which is great.
That's great.
Okay, so 3 types of mutualism. Here they are on a slide. I'll give you some more specific examples of these guys, but there are trophic relationships where you get a resource for a resource, usually food for food. And again, are usually nutrition based. And that's why we call them trophic. As we start to talk about communities next week, it's all about trophic pyramids and feeding interactions. Who eats who, how often. What does that affect downstream? But it can be defense, as we talked about with our ants. You get a service for a resource. And again, it doesn't always have to be protection, but it can also be habitat shelter as this like service that you get, often in return for nutrition or access to resources. In the case of our glass sponge with these little shrimps that live inside of it, the shrimp here help to keep parasites and invaders out of the sponge, and in return, they're protected from their predators by living inside the sponge. So they like clean the sponge and keep it going and help it be healthy, and then they're protected. What happens in the case here is that the juvenile shrimp swim in, and then the sponge, of course, has a top on it. And as they grow, they get too big to actually eat.
That's crazy.
It is totally crazy.
The whole life just inside of the...
Inside of the deep sea sponge. Again, that's your boat floated. Dispersive mutualism, again, you get a service for a service, and pollination is this service where, but it borders on the trophic too, like you're providing a nutrition service and you get dispersal of your pollen or offspring or gametes or seeds as a result of it. In dispersion, one of the big advantages is that you, as the dispersed species, get reduced competition. Your offspring are taken away from you, and thus they have less competition with you, and you have less competition with them. And so it's not just about getting spread out to be able to grow, it's also about your individual life as well. And it enhances reproduction by spreading them out, reducing competition, taking you to habitats where your species can start to grow.
So that's just like an animal eating the fruit, that's all.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, the kind of very classic, you eat the apple, you defecate the apple seed somewhere else. The apple tree grows, the apple tree seeds have access to your nutrients. You got nutrients by consuming the fruity part of the apple. And again, you can see these types of, again, what we might consider predatory relationships. There's a benefit to the plant inherent to this. Okay, all right. Degree of dependency, again, we can say you're an obligate mutualistic if you cannot survive without the other, either one or both species. It's facultative if you can exist independently. And it's the same, with obligate and facultative anaerobes in microbiology. If you've got to have it, then you're an obligate. If it's great, if you have it, you're okay. If you don't, then you're facultative. In looking at, again, these kind of lichens that we see here, they grow in these beautiful and amazing colors, but it's a fungal-algal relationship. And again, it can be facultative either way. Sometimes it's obligate. You only get that type of fungus growing in that location when the algae is present. The algae can only grow there because the fungus is also there. It's a very intimate relationship. The algae grows in a particular portion of the fungal hyphae. The fungus provides the shelter and the moisture. The algae provides the photosynthesis that keeps both of them going. It's a pretty tight one. Lichens then are able to grow in ecosystems where neither can grow individually. The fungus can't grow in these ecosystems like bare rock, newly tilled soil, without some photosynthesis, some primary production input. The algae can't grow there because it's too dry, too cold. But they do things. In terms of degree of specificity in mutualistic relationships, again, you can be a specialist or you can be a generalist, just like we've had with predation and feeding behaviors, ecosystems that you can live in. If you're a specialist, you have a very species-specific relationship. You do best with one mutualistic partner. Here we have these moths, of course, that have these very elongated proboscises to be able to feed on just a few types of trumpet flowers, right? Very similar to the hummingbird with its elongated beak and its very specialized tongue. They're dependent upon those types of flowers, very species specific. Likewise, the flowers are dependent upon those types of pollinators and nectarivores as their pollinators, okay? It's species specific both ways. Sunflower bees only go to sunflowers and pollinate sunflowers. That's great for the sunflowers because the bees are going to carry their pollen directly to a species in flower that they can pollinate. There's not going to be any mistakes made carrying pollen to a different plant. In a generalist, there's a wide range of species that are involved, and again, it just depends upon how wide the range is for these pollinators and nectarivores. It can be very specialized, but the same adaptation can also let you get to a variety of different types of plants. Would a tick be a generalist or a specialist?
Generalist.
Typically a generalist. And again, there's usually one species that each parasite or mutualistic partner does best with, but they can take advantage of a wide variety of host of partners as well. Okay, very last thing today, before I'm going to ask you to do the little class activities, will take you like 30 seconds. Again, in this idea of degrees and categories of mutualistic, again, we could say your degree of intimacy can set you into a different category of mutualism. Again, if you have a super close relationship, you're symbiotic, you live together in shared tissue structure, like the lichens or our coral, and they're symbiotic, the zooxanthellae, your endosymbionts. Definitely your mutualistic relationship with your gut microbacterium is a little bit closer and symbiotic than with your skin microbacterium. Or that of the mucous membranes of your lungs and the nasal passages. Non-symbionts live apart, they're free-living individuals, but then they're dependent on each other. And then again, our pollinators and our plants are another example of these non-symbiotic relationships. They're dependent on each other, but they're individual free-living organisms. Okay, your participation credit today is that I want you to write a haiku about one of the types of symbiosis that we've talked about today. It can be about parasitism, mutualism, commensalism. You can take a beautifully colored piece of paper.
575.
It is 575 syllables. So 5 syllables in the first line, 7 in the second, 5 in the third. Write me a symbiosis haiku.